Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our Navigating Data Risk and Regulatory Compliance in Financial Organizations. My name is Rob Trojanowski. I am the president and managing partner of Seaglass Technology. And I'd like to introduce Bill Falk, who is the president of go-to-market for ActiveFile, who will be moderating, and then the speaker, or the smart guy that's going to be answering all the questions for us, right? Asaf is the CTO and co-founder of ActiveFile.
Thank you, Robert. Radio check.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Good.
Loud and clear. Yeah.
Good morning and good day to everybody else. Thank you, Robert, for the introduction. Thank you, Robert, and the rest of the Seaglass crew for asking us to participate in this webinar. And why don't we go to the next slide there? Thank the synopsis / agenda slide. And Asaf, I'll let you do an intro for yourself in a moment. So the agenda for today, we're going to get through our introductions. The main thing we're trying to do here is talk about the trends that we see as a vendor in the space, global, local privacy, and security related trends around compliance and regulation. And then is it time to do something about it? Is it an if versus a when kind of question? And the pros and cons, we'll explore some of that later on, or Asaf will explore that later on. And then finally, we'll talk about solutioning around this with our great partner, Seaglass as a service provider and ActiveFile as an emerging tech company that's helping to fight this fight. We'll have questions at the end, plenty of time for questions at the end, and we'll get to them, like I said, towards the end. Over to you, Asaf.
Thank you, Bill. So a little bit about myself, Asaf Latai. So I have about 20, actually a little bit more years experience in the data security, data privacy space. I was the founder of one of the first data loss prevention solutions, today known as the ForcePoint DLP solution. So worked with a lot of large organizations, large banks, large insurance companies, healthcare, and so forth on the early days of data privacy and data security. We'll talk about those days a little bit, but we do see that the trend is that if in the past only enterprises needed to think about data privacy and data security, today it's becoming a pressing issue for any size organization, and we'll talk about that. So next slide. So first of all, this is a worldwide trend. So even if you take a look at Gartner basically says that by year-end 2024, over 75% of the world's population will have its personal data covered under modern privacy regulations. We'll talk about what those modern privacy regulations are. Another thing that is very important is that in the old days of data privacy, there used to be a DPO and chief privacy officer and data privacy and all kinds of things. Today, what the analysts are saying is that it falls into the lap of the CISO's office. This is a very interesting development because the CISO is a technical sort of organization, and this requirement is a business sort of risk. It's a business risk. So they're merging the business risk with the technology risk under the CISO, and as we'll see, the vCISO as well. So next slide.
Hey, and before you go into this, Asaf, can you express like a common denominator or theme that you're seeing across these issues?
Yeah, what we're going to see is that most of these new, what's called the new modern privacy regulations fall under, basically they're sort of, they're taking a framework for ISMSs and basically putting in place specific controls which they require. So they will, for example, if an ISMS says, do the homework and figure out what data is important for you, what the modern privacy regulation says is this is the data that you need to protect. So you need to protect SSNs, driver licenses, things of that sort. Or in other cases, it might be like CUI under CMMC and so forth. But they all come from the same sort of framework, which is being repurposed in different shapes to reflect the region, the locality, or the federal government.
Great.
Okay, next slide. So many auditors lay the blame for the trend on the ISO 27001 family of ISMSs, information security management systems, which basically operationalized the confidentiality, integrity, and availability CIA trend. And into that, they basically said, you have to analyze your risk, you have to analyze your, what are your business risk scenarios, and then what are the controls that you put in place in order to address the risk. It's sort of a free form that you fill in the paperwork and you show that you analyzed your risks and have the different information, and then you show the controls that you have. And at that point, you're basically ISO 27001. What the modern privacy regulation is, if you next, the government came in and said, no, we're not. If you have, for example, citizen records, if you have private information, then we're going to prescribe what you need to protect and also some of the controls that you need to have. So we're no longer allowing you to set your own controls based on your own interpretation of the risk, but we're going to tell you what data you have to protect and how you have to protect this. The first on this, with this sort of approach, was the European Union's GDPR, also known as the mother of all privacy regulations. Now, there were privacy regulations before these modern privacy regulations. So, for example, we all know Gramm-Leach GLBA. We all know, HIPAA, PCI DSS, and so forth. So it wasn't that there were no prescriptive requirements and regulations before, but in a lot of cases there were all kinds of different requirements and so forth. We'll see that in the new ones. So things like GDPR, CCPA, Virginia, CDPA, NYPA, NYCRR 500, and so forth, they more or less have the same structure, the same kind of concept, with a little bit of flavors, different flavors, and so forth. For example, how they treat international customers, how they treat local customers, and so forth. So, example case, in this case, we're all, we're New Yorkers here. So, NYCRR 500, let's see how it prescribes data. So, they basically tell us, they prescribe to us that NPI, non-public information, shall mean all electronic information that is not publicly available. And for example, they would say this is identifiers, so name, number, personal mark, and so forth, social security number, credit card, and so forth. And one of the nice things that they add is that even if you are not a covered entity under HIPAA, then any data that's provided by a healthcare provider or an individual. So basically expanding the coverage of HIPAA to financial services. So basically coming and prescribing what are the different pieces of information that you have to protect under NYCRR 500. And next, they will prescribe the controls. Next slide. So prescribing the controls, for example, training and monitoring, you have to monitor what your employees are doing. You have to monitor how they're using the non-public information and so forth. And the second thing you have to do is, for example, encryption of the non-public information. So as part of the cybersecurity program, you have to demonstrate to the regulator that you're actually protecting their information using encryption and so forth. Okay, next slide.
So before you go to the next one, so this is really good. You're really highlighting the attention paid to the data, right? And the specific regulations within the state of New York. Robert, I'm just curious, with your experience in and around New York and your time in this business, how are your clients adapting and evolving to these regulations?
Well, the first thing they have to do is understand the regulations, right? So, and if they have any gaps within those regulations, and we end up working with, not only the technical resources, but their general counsel, their chief compliance officers, just to work through the regulations with them. So, another example outside of the NYCRR is the new SEC cyber disclosure rule, right? And that's another webinar all by itself. But there's some risk management and strategy components in there that that have to be talked about and addressed, right? So we engage them with with the assessments and really try to identify the areas that they need help.
Great,
I hope that
thank you.
answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so how do you approach these in a sort of systemic way? What's a good way to prepare for all the different types and all the different evolutions of these regulations? And I think this is the key, because at the end of the day, you might have a mix of customers and clients from New York, and you might have some from California, and you might have some from Europe, and you might have some from different locations. And the regulations are always changing. The regulations keep having, new versions of them and so forth, and updates. So what's a good way to kind of prepare for whatever the regulator conjures up? So these are a couple of ISMS questions that we think that if you can answer them, then you're pretty ready to fill in whatever kind of compliance spreadsheets and control maps that you will need to do. So the first is the governance question. So for example, which regulations apply to the business? Now, it seems like a simple question, but it's not always a simple question, because sometimes you might have customers just from one local place or one locality, but there might be federal overlays, and there might be international overlays. For example, if you have European customers, if you have, and so forth. So you have to consider sort of what are the layers that you have in terms of regulatory compliance that you have to adhere to. Second is the information managed, and if necessary, protected? If you can answer that question, and we're talking truthfully, and actually know that you know where the information is and it is protected. For example, you use some sort of online vendor and that's the only place the information is, then you might be able to answer that question. A lot of times you need to run some sort of assessment to know the answer to that. And are there blind spots, like forgotten exported data, laptops, and things of that sort? So can you answer the governance question of which regulations apply to me? What is the data that's associated with that regulation? And is that information managed? And if it isn't, where are the blind spots? The data related questions are, what type of data does the company employees process and accumulate? This is very important, trying to understand what is the data that they accumulate, what is the data that they process, and the quantity of data. How much of it do you collect and store? And from that, kind of, do you need to store that data, and those questions. Next is usage related questions. So data usage pattern. How do employees use the data? Do they communicate with customers over email? Do they send it? Do they upload it to OneDrive, SharePoint, whatever else? And how do they use it on a daily basis? Do they just collect it? Some employees may collect the data over time and just it becomes a risk as the data piles up. Others might be actually using it correctly, doing whatever they need, and then deleting the data once they don't need it anymore, or transferring it to the server, or so forth. So do they use data safely? And the last is the risk-related question, which is probably the hardest question to answer. What is the quantity of risk? How much risk does the data pose to the organization? Now, obviously, the more data you have, the more careful you have to be, right? You never read in the newspaper about a company that had a breach and they had no data. That's not interesting. It's always millions of records, hundreds of thousands of records, and so forth. So how much of a risk does the data pose to the organization if something were to happen? How do we interpret and communicate the potential risk to the management? Again, this is not a simple question to answer. We know that there are, tens of thousands of records. We know that it's in different locations. Some of it's in laptops, some of it's on workstations, some of it's on server. How do we map this for the boss and say, this is what we have, and based on this is what we need to do, and what we recommend to do is to understand sort of what are the likelier data breach scenarios. So to be able to associate a risk with a plausible risk data breach scenario. Okay. Okay, so the next question is, do we do this? Do we go and we plan for this regulation, or do we wait? There are always, whenever there's a new regulation, whenever there's a new requirement, a good tendency is to hold off and wait, right? Now, I'm a vendor. I want everybody to jump in and do everything. But at the end of the day, even when there's a new regulation, a new version of ISO 27001, we might wait a bit until the auditors learn how to audit it, until everybody understands the new controls, until it's something that's doable. So how do you decide whether to wait it out or to actually do something? So obviously, the decision should take into account the risk associated with data and compliance. Why? Because if you have a lot of data, if you're at a very high risk of having a data breach or something like that, and the implications are harsh, then at that point, you should probably think about doing something to protect yourself, right? It might also be because of insurance. For example, if you think you're underinsured, if there is a possibility that you're underinsured, then definitely running through an audit and answering the ISMS questions might help you be better prepared for something that might happen. Now, answering this question is important whether your CISO is in-house or you use an MSP, MSSP to provide your vCISO services. So if the vCISO is external, you still need to kind of think, when do you want to jump in and prepare yourself for the privacy regulations? Now, the security team may not be the decision maker. And in my opinion, having done this for 20 years, it probably shouldn't be, right? At the end of the day, this is a business risk. If something happens to data, then the CEO's picture appears in the paper. Very rarely is it the vCISO or the IT manager or something like that. It's the CEO that appears there. It's the chairman of the board, it's so forth. It is a business risk. So at the end of the day, the security team might not be responsible for the decision, but they are responsible for presenting the actual risks to the board and saying, this is the situation, this is the amount of data that we have, this is the risk as best as we can define it, and so forth. Now, running a risk assessment, which is our proposed approach, helps you answer that question, helps you answer the question of whether to wait it out or jump right in, and also additional answers. For example, Are we sufficiently insured, or do we need to increase our insurance premiums and so forth? It's an objective assessment and can gauge the loss magnitude and loss probability, and we'll talk about that in a second. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go a little bit. I was, sort of warned not to go here. Can you introduce the rest of the slide? So this is the modern way enterprises look at risk. I will say you can ignore most of the squares. The only interesting ones are the three topmost ones. So basically what the FAIR model says, the factor analysis of information risk, says that when you look at risk, look at the loss magnitude. So loss magnitude is what is the impact on the business. And the loss event frequency is what is the frequency of data loss events. Now, obviously, we don't have answers to neither of these questions. But this is the way we need to think about data. So what does this mean? So for example, loss magnitude, we want to think about what are the different scenarios that cause us or our customers to lose money. For example, if they ransomware us, then we have to clean the machines, we have to recover the data. Hopefully we have disaster recovery and stuff like that. We have to recover the data. There's out-of-pocket expenses of dealing with the data breach. And then there might be like secondary losses, which are fines, penalties, all kinds of things. And we sort of think about all of this and say, this is the loss magnitude. The loss magnitude is how much it costs us out of pocket and any ancillary repercussions, which, maybe fines, penalties, might even be customers leaving us for another business. And the loss of event frequency, which is another hard thing to do, it's a little bit easier for larger organizations, even though since the threat landscape always changes, it's not a perfect science. Basically says, what is the likelihood of a particular event? How many people, so think about it, how many people are pinging us and trying to get access through a firewall? And then for each 100,000 of these attempt, one packet manages to get in. And then out of these packets, 1 out of 1,000 manages to do something. And out of these, 1 out of 1,000 manages to install something. And most of the time, those things fail. They get captured by the EDR, by the XDR, whatever. But then 1 out of, 10,000 actually installs some version of Cobalt Strike or something like that, and then starts maybe encrypting data, maybe stealing data, and so forth. So that's the loss event frequency. And when we install EDRs, firewalls, and stuff like that, we're trying to push that down, right? We're trying to spread those events that manage to get through as far apart as we can, so that, hopefully zero, but as we know, it's never zero. So that's kind of the way to think about it. So what we're going to see is we're going to talk a little bit about loss magnitude and how we calculate loss magnitude, and then get to the to how we kind of present this and so forth in different scenarios. So
and Asaf, before you go into that, I posted the link to the FAIR Institute in the chat. Everybody should be able to see that.
Worthwhile reading, definitely worthwhile reading. So in this case, what we're seeing is a page from our product, Actifile, but it can be any sort of tool that helps you do data discovery and try to gauge the value of the data. So what we see here are, we ran a risk assessment for a particular customer, and this kind of shows us what are the number of files that have things like, credit cards, have things like ACH numbers, social security numbers, and so forth. And how many files, how many records in these files, and then a valuation of the risk that's associated with that data. A typical number that's used in the industry for per record. And when you look at this per record, it actually leads to the reason we do this per record rather than looking at out-of-pocket expenses and things of that sort, which some of the data loss calculators do, is one, because it's sort of the way the enterprises and most of the large organizations do it. And the second reason is it lends a good path to reducing the risk. For example, if I take these records and I encrypt them, or if I take these records and I delete them or archive them or so forth, so they're no longer accessible on the machines, then I've reduced the risk. We can actually see here that some of these records are encrypted, so that reduces the loss magnitude that's associated with the data. Okay. The data spread is really important. Is the data on servers that are hopefully protected, using good IDM practices and so forth, or are they on somebody's laptop and so forth? The amount of times that you would see an owner or specific people who, like to have the data available locally. So you have these, data hoarders and so forth. So understanding how the data is spread around the organization is really important in kind of understanding whether there are single point of failures or whether the data is spread around the organization. And we'll see how we take a look at that in sort of a different way down the line. Next slide. The data usage question. So this was the data. This was the data questions. Now it's the data usage questions. How are people using the data? Now, one of the issues with the traditional approaches, which would be to look at singular events, somebody was uploading something, somebody was downloading something. Today people most of the time think in terms of applications, whether they're local processes or web applications. So people uploading it to people taking the data to OneDrive, whether it's a personal or a enterprise OneDrive, people sharing it. One of the questions is always, are people sharing sensitive data over WhatsApp? That's an important question. If they are, maybe that's acceptable, maybe that's not. But you have to deal with that scenario and make a decision in terms of privacy policy if it doesn't prescribe that particular situation. So you have to say, we allow our teams to communicate with customers over WhatsApp and under these terms. For example, sharing one piece of data or not sharing pieces of data and so forth. So that's an important question. We talked about the loss magnitude as it deals with data spread. So data spread is how it's spread around the organization. So this is why we think this is actually pretty important. So what we see here is we took this customer and we analyzed the loss potential per number of compromised laptops and number of compromised workstations. And we have the average risk. So we take the risk divided by the number of machines, which is in blue. And we have the worst case, which is we take the laptop with the most amount of data, and we take the laptop with the most amount of data, and then we take the one with the second highest amount of data, and so forth. And we do the same with workstations. And what we see here is, if we take a look at the left, is that in this case, at least one of the laptops has a lot of data. So the difference between the average case and the average case and the worst case is pretty substantial. It's about $2.2 million. So absolutely, in this case, you want to be able to clean up at least one or two machines and that will reduce the risk considerably, or encrypt the data on that machine, or deal with that machine. If you take a look at the workstations, you can see on the right-hand side, you'll see that the difference between the worst case, and the average case is not as bad. Okay, but again, if I show this to one of the things that this shows me is, if I take a look at the average case, is that what I really want to do is to prevent lateral motion in the network, right? So the risk is substantial if they can get in on one machine and then infect the rest of the machine, because every machine that they infect is going to contribute another $150,000 to the loss potential, right? So the loss magnitude is going to increase the more they're able to attack. So by looking at this data from different perspectives, I can understand not just the loss magnitude for the entire organization, which is always scary, right? $80 million, but also what is plausible scenarios, which is somebody breaking into one laptop, two laptops, five laptops, three workstations, a combination, and then you can work those different combinations to sort of understand and say, we have a high likelihood of this being painful, or we're pretty okay. Okay, next slide. Example 2 of the risk evaluation is the age of the data. So one of the things that is really annoying to CEOs who underwent data breach and so forth is when they figured out that 90% of the data or 80% of the data that was compromised was very old data, right? So it's one thing to say, this is the risk of doing business, the cost of goods sold and all that stuff. It's one thing to say that this is a risk that we have to take, but when you discover that the information that really caused you harm was loan applications that were 10 years old and that were repaid 7 years ago or 8 years ago, and are now being added to the list of data that you lost, that's pretty annoying. So understanding how the data is spread in terms of the age of the data is really important in saying, okay, we don't need all of this risk. We can probably reduce 90% of this risk if we just take care of old data, if we just have a better data retention policy. Okay, next slide. So this is where I can talk a little bit about what we do, what Actifile does. You saw some of the screenshots from the system. So we have, so as I said, I came from a DLP background. DLP is a great product. We invented it maybe with one or two other startups in the early 2000s. The problem with it is it's really difficult to create a process, especially if you don't have a lot of FTEs for it. So we were looking at a way to come up with a system that helps you do this in a very easy manner. So basically, you push the agents look for the data based on the different regulations, you select the regulations, and then it classifies the data for you. It quantifies the risk based on public numbers. It monitors the data flow, and so it can prioritize the different applications and web portals that use data, that use sensitive data. And then, assuming you have a high number that you have to deal with, then it can actually automatically encrypt the data using file level encryption and transparently decrypt the data again. Whenever the user needs to use the data, Actifile will decrypt the data for you. So this helps comply with most of the privacy regulations. it helps prevent external ransomware threats, at least the data thieving side of it, because, right, they pull, and since it's file level, they pull the data with the encryption on it. So AES 256 encrypted data, and alerts on data usage anomalies. So you can actually see when people are starting to use applications that maybe they shouldn't, or maybe at least you should be aware that you're using of that, those applications. Customers typically see a reduction in risk as high as 90% with very little upfront expense, just by setting, for example, delayed encryption, which takes care of the older data and so forth. So that's a little bit about us. We have to remember that 95% of data breaches occur because of human error or malicious actors. And we can try to minimize as much as we can the event frequency, but a very good approach is to also reduce the loss magnitude. If we can encrypt and reduce the loss magnitude, then the implication of these 95% of data breaches is nullified or substantially reduced. Robert?
Yep, sure. One more slide. We'll talk about our assessment and our assessment process. So we have a product that we call Seaglass Hunt, and it really takes we do a deep dive into everything from network devices, assets on the network, DNS, as well as asking questions about particular policies and procedures as it relates to not only preventing a breach, but what do you do if you have a breach, right? So who does what, where are the roles and responsibilities? So we take a look at some what really looks like a list of rudimentary controls, right? So, and if these controls are all implemented properly, they go a long way to a healthy security hygiene, and will help certainly with compliance. This assessment that we do generally takes about 6 weeks or so through a series of tools that we use, and just some question and answer stuff. At the end of it, you'll end up with a nice report that could be anywhere between 20 or 30 pages, depending on the amount of data that we collect, with a lot of really nice charts and graphs to take a look at. It's a nice report that gives you a deep look into your environment. But to oversimplify it, we want to give you 3 really important pieces of information, right? One is the things that you're doing really well, right? Because it's not all bad. We know that you're working really hard, and you have some good, good tools in place. And then maybe there's some areas where you need improvement. And then lastly, there's some areas, and these might be the blind spots, right? Where you have some risk or vulnerability, right? These, or even just gaps that you don't know how to fill. So once you have all that information, it's up to you. If you'd like to engage us, we're happy to provide you with, we would create a roadmap or a plan to do some remediation. Either you do it, we do it. It's fine with us. So, and if you want more information, feel free to reach out to me directly, and we could talk about how this fits maybe into your organization. I think that's all.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. This is Bill again. So thank you to Asaf and Robert for the sharing of all your knowledge. We are getting a nice handful of questions. So are you guys up for answering some questions?
Absolutely. Yeah.
We'll try to make sure they're not super hard. First question from the audience is, what more specifically is involved in performing a risk assessment for a company, and what the follow-on is like, what does the company typically need to prepare to participate in that? I guess that would be more for Robert.
So typically, an NDA, right? That's the first thing. So we have to get that stuff out of the way. And then we start off with, we have a project plan that we follow, and it includes everything from us putting a sensor on site for 2 or 3 days that gets shipped back and forth. Everything has, we'll either come to site and install it if we need to, and then collect it after those few days, or, we'll ship it to you with directions and it can get plugged into the network. And it doesn't gather any data. It really monitors data flow for us. Then there's some other tools that will want to run and take snapshots of the data on the network, and so it's a process that we go through, right? So it's not like we spend 2 weeks preparing for this, right? We do it in chunks of time. That's why it takes about 6 weeks for us to get through it, and then create the report, right? Again, it's a very manual process. At the end of this, we have a ton of data. And we're not running. We're using tools to help us parse that data, but at the end of the day, last thing is that there's a human being going through the data, to determine really what the risk is. If during the course of this assessment we find something that needs to be addressed immediately, we'll stop everything and let you know. And
Great.
that would be if if we found somebody that might be snooping around the network that you weren't aware of.
The data risk assessment portion of that really is about pushing the agents or whatever out to the devices that you want to discover the data on, and at that point you let the system run. If you want to understand how people use the data, then you would want to give it a little bit of time so that people have a chance to exercise the different applications. And right, if you install it over a weekend, and then you might have a good discovery sort of answer, but you won't know what people actually use in the course of a day-to-day business. So our recommendation has always been around 14 days, so to give it about 2 weeks, so that people have a chance to answer emails, respond to tickets, do whatever it is that they do, run through, right, if you're financial services or a bank, run through different investment scenarios and stuff like that. So
very good. So a question for Asaf. So it sounds like Actifile is kind of a DLP. Is that how you identify the product and position it, or is it something different?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of the DLP space. I was one of the early founders of a company called Port Authority, which we then sold to WebSense and became FirstPoint. So DLP is a product I know well. DLP is focused on the workflows. Is basically a rather big system that allows you to track the workflows that result in data being exposed. So somebody emailing data outside and so forth. It creates events that are typically fed into the SIM or SOC or whatever, and then somebody has to go through this. That's a lot of work, and usually DLP teams require some sort of assistance from the business owners, because how is an IT guy supposed to know whether something is acceptable or not? What we did here was actually turn this upside down and say, we're not interested in the individual events. We're interested in the sum of the data. So how much data do we have? How much data goes to WhatsApp? Even if somebody sent $10 worth of SSNs over WhatsApp, it's not a reason to start, locking down all the network and all that. Because continue monitoring, and if it doesn't happen great. If it does happen again, and you start aggregating, and you see that the number keeps increasing, then you have to deal with it, right? There's always outliers, right? If once every couple of months somebody does something, who cares? The risk is very minimal. So our approach is we turn the DLP sort of equation from being an event-driven system to being completely 100% risk-based. So you only address those things that have a high level of risk that's associated with them, something that you can't ignore. And at that point, you can encrypt, you can block, you can do whatever you need to do, but you don't deal with the outliers. You just deal with the main sources of risk.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the work you're doing is more preventative versus reactive. Maybe that's another way to look at it. And then the extension to that is then how we talk about risk, and the company is going to establish an amount of risk through Actifile. Then how specifically is that risk reduced from a monetary standpoint?
Absolutely. So I would say that it's combination of reactive, but it's reactive once you see that the aggregate amount is high, right? If the aggregate amount is high, then you're posing a serious, you can't ignore this level of risk. So that's why you react to it. If it's a one-off, then you don't react to it and you don't care about it. You sort the columns based on the amount of risk, and then you address the ones that the risk is high.
Or you address it differently, right? So if the risk is low, it could just be that there's an employee training portion that maybe needs to be reevaluated or readdressed, right? So if you're seeing some one-offs once in a while, it could just be training the people a little bit, just retraining maybe, right? So it doesn't have to be shut it down. You can't do that. It could be, it could just be the training, what to look for, what to do, what not to do.
And also, a lot of times outliers are, you have a customer and the customer is at the airport and they need their data and so forth, and that's the only way to get the data to them and so forth, in which case, even in the DLP space, eventually the SOC operator would sit there and say, looked at it, it's something that an outlier. So the issue is, if the number is low, my recommendation is to just ignore it, right? I'm not saying that in all cases, but in the majority of cases, you just ignore it. If the number is high, you can't ignore it. The business owners won't let you ignore it and so forth. So at that point, if you see that the number is high, then you have different controls that you can put in place. For example, encrypting the data. If the data is encrypted, then people can do whatever they want with it. They won't be able to open it outside of the organization. Or you can block it. So you can set up certain applications with certain policies and say you cannot upload SSNs to WhatsApp or something like that. So those are, for example, two options that you can do with Actifile. Can't copy them to a USB key, can't do things of that sort.
Right.
Very good. And thank you to the audience for the questions. One more for Robert. So in addition to the risk assessment and some of the stuff that we've been talking about, what other services does CGlass provide to its customers?
So outside of the risk assessment, we are a full service managed IT and IT security firm. Everything from remote monitoring, help desk support. We could be 100% outsourced IT department for any firm, and we are for a lot of our customers. Other customers, we support their IT staff as well. So anything project based, right? Upgrades, cloud migrations, digital transformation. So that's our bread and butter. Yeah.
So thank you for that. And then back over to Asaf. And again, we're time for just a couple more questions while everybody get on with their day. Is the let's see this. So so there's a lot of attention paid to the risk reduction and the use of encryption and so forth. What if an encrypted file needs to be shared outside of there's a legitimate need to have it shared outside the organization. How does Actifile support that use case?
That's a good question. So basically, if the files are encrypted, then in a lot of cases you might need to share them. So first of all, if you one of the things that we highly recommend is to use delayed encryption, which basically says that you don't encrypt data until, for example, 30 days have passed or something like that. So most of the data, when you talk about financial services, you talk about insurance, you talk about most of the data is not going to be used after a couple of days. So, there's a new loan application, there's a new investment opportunity and so forth. After a couple of days, that investment opportunity is old, right? So in a lot of cases, if you just use the delayed encryption, you will find very little is being done with older data. So that's one of the easy ways to reduce risk without almost at all affecting the workflows. You do want to set, for example, with Actifile, you can set certain channels, for example, Outlook as a trusted channel, in which case, whenever somebody applies a protected document to Outlook, it will decrypt that file, and then obviously at that point it will be dealt with by the Outlook filtering and so forth. So if you have a gateway and things of that sort. So there are ways to tell the system to decrypt with different scenarios. We're also adding a feature which allows you to right-click decrypt the file so that the user can decide to override the system. Obviously, that gets logged, and then they can do whatever they need to do with the file. So
very good. And then the final question, I'm not sure who this would be. I think it'd go to either one. But what is controls mapping? Right. Did I read that properly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Robert,
I'll let Asaf handle that. Yeah.
Okay. So one way to minimize the cost of compliance, especially when you have a lot of different frameworks that you have to comply with, or different regulations that you have to comply with, is to map the different controls, and say this control in CCPA is this control in NYCRR 500, and which is this control and so forth. And if you can do that mapping, then you only fill in the controls once, and the mapping will fill it in the proper Excels and so forth. So it's a way to that you and this is one of the reasons we say always start with an audit and understand your data, because once you understand the data, then filling in the different Excels and so forth becomes easier. If you just sit with the Excel and then you look for one type of data and then you look for another type of data and you start interviewing your users, that's a lot of work, and you end up with having to do this again and again. So controls mapping helps you reduce that. And when you merge that with an audit, it becomes substantially cheaper. Not cheap, but less expensive.
And it's also worth noting that the remediation, or to being able to adhere to a control, I mean, it's the same across the board. If you do one thing, you can take care of a handful of, you can check a lot of boxes off of that Excel, right? So
yeah, and sometimes you can do things like, if one regulation requires you to replace your password every, 3 months, and the other every month, then you just choose the harshest one, because that covers all the rest of them as well. So
exactly,
so you
right.
can do things like that. Yeah.
Very good. And we got a couple more minutes, just like parting shot for Asaf and Robert. Any final words of wisdom before we conclude?
Yeah, I see another question here about how to convince customers to do these type of, an MSP, for example. How do you convince somebody to do an audit, or how do you convince somebody to use services or applications such as ActiveFile? And I think the answer is, if they don't understand that they are under risk, then that's going to be very hard to do. I think it's the question on whether the MSP or MSSP is also a VCSO. If you're a VCSO and they don't give you the money you need to do an audit and so forth, then I would resign my VCSO role in that case, because you cannot protect something you don't know, right? So you have to be able to do these types of things. If you're not a VCSO, then and you're just doing IT services, then you have to kind of think of what you do. But if you don't know how much data is there, if you don't understand what on the data side and the vulnerability side, then it's very hard to manage a network, and eventually something's going to happen and they're going to blame you, even though they did not allow you to do anything. So that's a tough one. I do think at the end of the day, if you don't know what it is, what you're protecting and what you're managing and so forth, then bad things may happen. And that's it. That I think is sort of the parting, thought.
That's your parting shot.
Yep.
It's a good one.
If you don't do
Robert.
anything, bad things might happen. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I was going to give my my contact information. Thank you for putting it up there. So
there you go.
if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. That's my direct line, 212-886-0791. And my email is robert@cglasstechnology.com.
Very good.
That's all I have. Yeah.
That was a lot. And thank you to Asaf and Robert, and to the audience for taking time today. Hopefully we imparted some knowledge and wisdom for today. Thank you again, and we will conclude.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.